Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to be talking about Autopsy, the last hours of Owen Hart. Now, the Owen Hart issue, of course, has been discussed time and time again. I don't think there's a wrestling death outside of Chris Benoit that has been more investigated than Owen Hart. But they still do an investigation because there could also be ancillary issues that led to Owen Hart's death. Like, tiny things like when Bruiser Brody got stabbed, he had been taking aspirin, so he bled more than usual. So those sorts of things that most people don't pay attention to, these episodes try to expand upon or look at as if that could have been a reason why Owen Hart passed. And some of the things that they looked into, of course, was history of drug abuse, history of alcoholism, and other physical issues that might have occurred, such as stress, vertigo, etc. And that's pretty much what this episode is going to be about. And if you want to know the gory details of what actually would happen to Owen Hart on a physical level, it's pretty disturbing. The cast features Martha and the kids, Oj and Athena, as well as Owen's sisters and brothers, Bruce, Allison, and Ross, and then Jeff Jarrett and Kevin Eck. Now, they tell the story. Owen Hart passed away May 23rd, 1999. At 34 years old, he fell 78 feet to his death in St. Louis, Missouri. And they discuss, possible stress-related issues with Owen. Was he under a tremendous amount of stress that may have led to some kind of nervousness or some kind of physical discomfort, which may have led to him hitting the switch soon and falling down. And they decided to have this discussion. And there was some talk that Owen Hart was scared of heights and that he didn't really like heights. So he may have been under some kind of stress at the time. But he had done the rappel from the roof before. So that's, I don't know. You could still do it once. I guess you could still be scared of heights, but he did it multiple times at this point. And they were talking about whether he's under some kind of pressure. And Martha told the story about this angle that was pitched to Owen in January of 99 to do a love triangle with Deborah and Jeff. And Owen refused it. He thought that the storyline was too risque, and that they actually showed some footage from TSN Gallagher of Owen Hart saying he didn't like to do those sorts of storylines. He also didn't agree with the direction of the product. He thought that the product was getting too risque and it was getting too crude. It was getting too violent. And he wanted to be a pro wrestler that held up the family's reputation. He wanted to be, like the good old Harts from, Western Canada. And he didn't want to get involved with all of that stuff. So he has refused creative, and now, of course, they're talking about and moving in a direction where the Blue Blazer is quite possibly a punishment. That to return to his old character where he debuted in 1989, I believe it was, where he debuted in the WWF as the Blue Blazer, and as sort of a return to the old gimmick. And there's some idea that he might have been under a tremendous amount of stress at the time due to the fact that at 34, he's nearer to the end of his career than the beginning. They're starting to get crude on television. They're starting to try to get him involved with these things, and he's resisting it. There was also, of course, a lot of talk that Owen was on his way out of the company anyway, and somewhere near retirement or something to that effect. I mean, that's been out there for a long time. They discussed drug usage. Now, they did find benzodiazepines were found in Owen's hotel room, which was diazepam and alprazolam. They were found in his hotel room, but none were found in his system when he fell from the roof. And of course, they said, Owen lived a pretty clean lifestyle. Of course, he probably took some painkillers. I mean, he was a pro wrestler. That's not out of the ordinary. Then they tell us that, benzos, or having an addiction to benzos or using them, they can reduce anxiety, which is, of course, a sign of stress. And they also help with insomnia, but they also cause memory issues. They also cause a loss of balance. And you can sometimes have difficulty concentrating if you're on those. But again, like they said earlier, Owen didn't have any of that stuff in his system. So none of that led to what happened when he got up on the catwalk. He also did not have alcohol in his system. He also did not have steroids in his system. So he was pretty clean. He might have been under some pressure and maybe had some physical or some signs of stress, but that's just the nature of the job. And, having to do a crazy stunt that you're not really trained for. But he wasn't under the influence of any drugs or alcohol or anything like that. Now, when it comes to stress, Jeff Jarrett, who of course is Owen Hart's friend, he said that he doesn't recall Owen being under any particular stress the day of the show or Owen being nervous at all. Owen tested the harness earlier in the day. This is something people continuously miss. The vest was tested several times. He was even tested on a sandbag that's heavier than Owen. So that's clearly one of the things that they wanted to look into, is whether the vest had been tested appropriately and whether Owen had participated in the testing before. Now, they did say that Owen had no previous experience with this sort of clip that was on the vest, which is, I think, possible because WWE did want to change that. They wanted it to look more like Sting. This is going to be an abbreviated version of the Dark Side of the Ring thing, by the way. So it's like the clip that he had at Survivor Series. It was difficult for him to get out of it because it was so secure. They wanted it to look more like Sting, where he could just yank it and it comes loose. But they bought the wrong kind of clip in order to do that. And Owen had no previous experience with this sort of clip, so his inexperience does need to be taken into account when he ended up falling, of course. Now, Autopsy does say pretty much that the cape, when it was put on, because Owen, when he tested the clip, he did not wear the cape. The cape, he wasn't in full costume. He was in basically like regular clothes. And of course, the sandbag is not going to be wearing a cape. But when Owen went up to do the actual stunt, he was in full costume, which included a mask and a cape. And the cape was around his neck. And it was in the way of the harness. And when he adjusted his cape, he clipped the shackle and it came loose. And that's how he ended up falling. And they just said that Owen Hart fell at about 48 miles per hour. There was no damage to his head, spine, neck, or skull, but his left arm was broken in several places. They did external CPR, which was, of course, ineffective. There were graphics to show the internal injuries to Owen because he severed his thoracic aorta from the collision, which is in your chest. And it's the largest artery in your cardiovascular system. That's what we get from Dr. Michael Hunter. And so he had all this internal hemorrhaging, and his blood pressure went down to 0, which led to a lung collapse and blood flooding his chest cavity. And they gave him 2 shots of adrenaline to try to keep his body going, but obviously it failed to stimulate his heart function, and Owen Hart ended up passing away. So it's incredibly difficult to watch in terms of an episode, but it's pretty straightforward. Everybody knows what happened, but some of the gory internal damage that Owen Hart suffered from the fall is pretty crazy. And it's very, of course, these episodes are always very sad. It's made even more sad because his family is involved with it. And of course, when the family is involved, it's very emotional. But in the episode, there's nothing in the episode that you haven't seen or heard before, unless you are unfamiliar with the medical terms. That stuff is obviously going to be new to you if you're unfamiliar with the medical terms, or if you haven't read any of the autopsy reports or anything like that. And these episodes are made for general audiences. They're not made for wrestling fans. So when you see something like this, it's meant to explain to people who are not wrestling fans how wrestling works, and to frame the story for them. But the Owen Hart story was pretty straightforward. WWE bought the wrong clip, there was an accident, and he fell and died. I did appreciate that they tried to look at what outside influences may have led to him passing away, about whether he was under a tremendous amount of stress, whether he had been doing drugs and alcohol, whether, these things have been appropriately tested, because these are a lot of these questions. They don't come up a lot, but they are questions that if you work at a job, these are questions that human resources and whatever want to know. If you were involved in some kind of accident, the first thing they want to do is to get you out of there, get you to some kind of urgent care, and then they're going to have it drugs and tested and alcohol tested and all that kind of stuff to make sure the problem isn't you. And quite often, when we talk about Owen Hart, and it was obvious that he wasn't under any drugs or alcohol at the time, because that would have come out almost immediately if he had been. But that's one of the things that is very rarely talked about, is the signs of physical stress, nervousness, and which could also lead to accidents. Being anxious leads to a lot of issues as well. I work with people who have high anxiety. It's very difficult for them to function. It's very difficult for them to focus. And to know, and it felt good to know that he wasn't under that kind of stress, that even if this was a punishment, which I'm not entirely sure that it was, also I'm not entirely sure that it wasn't, that he didn't feel, a tremendous amount of pressure to do this. And there was no tremendous amount of nervousness or coercion to get him to do it. Obviously, he would rather have not done it. I think that's true in any case. But it wasn't like he was fretting about it. He had done it before. He had even tested it earlier. I think he rejected to do a second test. That was in the police report. I believe in previous videos I discussed this, that Owen had tested the clip earlier. They had tested it with a sandbag, then they tested it with Owen. And then Owen was offered another test, I guess in full costume, and he decided he had done it once. He wasn't going to do it again until he actually had to do it from the ceiling. And that led to him finally doing the test in full costume, which, of course, that along with the wrong clip being purchased is what led to Owen Hart's tragic accident. Now, if you're a wrestling fan, almost none of this stuff is going to be new to you. This is going to be completely for general audiences, people who are not really wrestling fans. So that's how it's presented. It's presented as an accident, but a highly emotional incident. Maybe even neglect by WWF and the company that produced the clip. But that's all just obvious, the angle that they were going to take with Martha being in the documentary. I mean, I just hate to put it that way, but that's Martha's stance, is that WWF and the company that made the clip are negligent. And you could argue that they were negligent or that they were incompetent, which is probably a better term to use. Because if the WWF didn't know which kind of clip to buy, they should have just stuck with the one that they had. And if the company hadn't lied about, or the seller hadn't lied about the kind of clip that they were selling, then Owen Hart would be alive today. So none of this would be new to wrestling fans, but these episodes are for general audiences, people who are not that familiar with pro wrestling, but become familiar enough to follow the story of the passing of a famous professional wrestler. All right, like, share, subscribe. I talk to you guys later. Peace out.
No one does it better.